They just got baths this morning.
Oh, very nice.
He's not
Fluffy.
too happy about it, but it's part of life, right? Getting baths.
That is true.
Getting back from where?
Baths,
Huh?
They're bad.
baths. They got washed.
Some people have the trucks pull up to their house. My neighbor does to
Well,
get the
yeah.
grooming done.
You have a little dog in a laundry room sink, it works out, I found. If you don't have to be clipping them and all that stuff at the same time. All right, so.
There's B. Good morning.
Good morning.
You have a nice group today.
So what are we doing? Parak Gimel today?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm just opening it on my iPad here.
Okay.
It's Parshat Toledo.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, Toledo.
All right, let us go ahead and begin. Again, remember to mute yourselves if you're not speaking and be courteous to others. Let us begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher tzivanu v'tzivanu b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the world, who has sanctified us with your commandments, commanded us to engage in the words of Torah. Amen.
Amen.
Here, Rabbi, she's all yours.
Good morning, everybody.
Good
We are on
morning.
Parak Gimel, I believe, on page 67. The issue of intermarriage. So last week we talked about something related to this, and now to this week, the beauty of Rebecca and the sort of dating issues. And this week we're talking about intermarriage. Of course, throughout most of our lifetimes, attitudes to intermarriage in general, of any sort of intermarriage, has changed very, very, very dramatically. And this is something that that we are going to explore today. Any opening? Miriam sends her best. I spoke to her yesterday. I had to drive to Scottsdale. Unfortunately, a woman who's not a member is about to pass away. And so I visited her and I had a chance to talk to Miriam in the car. She sends her best. She says she's about to go to her grandson's modern Orthodox wedding in New Jersey and visit her son in Michigan. And so she may or may not be able to come today because she's so busy packing. So, at 102, that's not bad that she's making multiple visits. I did tell her that, maybe she should go to Paris, but she says Michigan and New Jersey is enough for the moment. Any opening comments about intermarriage or about this parsha or about Esav and Jacob or anything like that? Okay, then we can just start reading. Good morning, everybody. Everybody knows each other, I take it. You all already know D. And we're always looking for new participants. So if you have a friend, member or non-member, please invite them to come try us out. Okay, page 67, who would like to open with read? Minya.
I have a question, Mike.
Yes.
In the past few weeks, you used a word that meant worshiping other gods. It sounded like mono tree.
Oh, monaltry, yes.
How do you spell that?
M-O-N-O, like monotheism, but then at the end it'd be L-A-T-R-Y.
All right, because I tried to look it up and I guess I had the spelling way off.
And then henothism, which is Heno, and then theism is another one. Now, I don't really remember the difference between the two, but they're both not exactly monotheistic, but close. So
Okay, thank you.
one of them you believe your God is the most important God and the other gods exist, but they're not really very important. In the other one, you believe that your God is your God and the other gods are out there, but not relevant to you, something like that. So both of them are almost monotheistic, but not quite. And the theory is that this is what the early Israelites developed, and that eventually, over many hundreds of years became monotheism, but not right away.
Thank you.
And Sai can tell you more about this, right, Sai? Okay. Who would like to read page 67, Perek Gimel, the issue of intermarriage? We're in Parshat Toldot, so we're still in the book of Genesis, but we're well into the story of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Okay, B.
The issue of intermarriage. The subject of marriage is raised twice in our Torah portion. We are told that when Esau was 40 years old, he married 2 Hittite women, and that the marriages were a source of bitterness to Isaac and Rebekah.
Oh boy, stop there. So how many Jewish mothers do we have here?
All of us.
Now your son marries not 1, but 2 Hittite women. How do you react?
Badly.
A, you threaten to disinherit him. B, you threaten to kill him. C, you threaten to kill both Hittite women. D, another option.
You threatened to kill yourself.
Okay, D, threaten to kill yourself.
But why 2?
Yeah, well, that's it. I guess, you need 2 Hittite women to keep you happy. We have to explore more what the Hittite women, what their reputations were like. But it's a source of bitterness to both Isaac and Rebekah. And as we talked about, Isaac and Rebekah didn't necessarily see eye to eye on very much. But on this, they were both bittered. And this is certainly not going to help the relations between Esau and his parents, and particularly with his mother. Now, this is this actually from the Bible, or is this something suggested by one of the commentaries?
From the Bible.
Yes, and it's quoted there. It's Genesis 26, chapter 26, verse 34. So you can look it up in your Tanakh. And when you come into my office, if you remind me, anyone who is a regular at Torah study, I will give them a free Jewish Publication Society Tanakh. How's that for a deal? Okay. And okay. B, back to you. You can keep reading.
Then near the end of the Torah portion, it is reported that Rebekah tells Isaac that she is worried that Jacob, like Esau, will marry a woman from among the Canaanites rather than someone from their ancestral home, the Padam Aram. Isaac agrees with her. He sends with Jacob and instructs him to go to Padam Aram to find a bride among the daughters of Laban, Rebekah's brother. He also blesses Jacob, telling him that God will give him and his children rights to the land of Israel, as was promised to Abraham, his grandfather. When Esau hears that his father has instructed Jacob not to marry a Canaanite woman, has sent him off to Padam Aram, and has given him an additional blessing, he is hurt and angry. Perhaps to find favor with his parents, he marries his first cousin, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael. He does not, however, divorce his Hittite wives.
All right. So he marries a third wife. This one is Yishmael's daughter, And Yishmael is from a Jewish point of view, is kind of like the black sheep of the family.
Wow.
And hi, Lorraine. Hi, Bert. Hi, Ray.
Hi, Bert, say hi.
So we're so for those who just logged on, Ray and Lorraine and others, we're talking about intermarriage, page 67, and Esav has married 2 Hittite women, and now he's married the daughter of Yishmael. Rebecca and Isaac don't like this, so they've told their other son Jacob to make sure to go home to Padan Aram, which is in Iraq, and to marry a cousin there. So that Lavan is Rebecca's brother. Lavan means in Hebrew and in English it means white. So Lavan is basically Mr. White. And Lavan and Rebecca are brother and sister. Therefore, Lavan's daughters would be first cousins to Jacob. And we talked about that, I think, last week already. And so in Jewish law, this is permitted, not necessarily recommended, but it's not prohibited. And that doesn't mean that you have to do it, right? So in Jewish law, if something is permitted, the rabbis can always prohibit it. But if something is prohibited, the rabbis cannot permit it. So you can always make things stricter, but you can't make them more lenient in traditional Jewish law. So we have here a lot about marriage and a lot about who to marry. And we see that Esav has tried retroactively to marry a 3rd woman that would be more acceptable to his parents. And whether this is helping or not is a subject that we'll get into. Obviously, the heterosexual marriage is the only option in those days. There's no gay marriage. So if there was, this would open a whole nother possibility to biblical unions. Okay, Pam and then Babette.
I'm just surprised that Esau thought it was a good idea to marry, one, his first cousin, and secondly, not to divorce the 2 Hittite women who were the start of the problem in the first place. I mean, he's trying to get in the good, get in with his parents, and he's really not going about it very well.
Yes, well, this is Esav's problem, that he's kind of he's not very thoughtful. He doesn't respect, he doesn't do what his parents want. He's trying here to placate them a little bit, but he probably loves the 2 Hittite wives. So he's not divorcing them. They're his wives. They're more important than his parents, but he'll add a 3rd wife to placate them or to try to placate them. I don't know. I don't have 1 wife, so what do I know about having 3 wives? But I don't know that it's
You'll be busy.
Babette and then Bernie. Babette and then Bernie.
It's such a guy thing, though.
I wonder if there was like a pecking order. I mean, as you marry, is the first one more important, or
I would think so, yes.
So the 3rd wife is of lesser importance and not equal importance.
Well,
Or the first ones are the practice wives.
all right, about that. I'm not responding to Pam's last comment because I don't know what I would say. All right, Babette and then Bernie. And then Ray.
No, I had asked already, like, are the wives of equal status, or is the first wife,
I don't know.
the superior one or the more important one?
This is a side question, what was the marriage customs in the ancient Near East at that time? And, I would have to do a little research on that, or a lot of research on that. But I would imagine that the first wife had seniority, yes. Bernie.
I'm not sure I agree with the
Bernie,
premise.
speak into the
that-
microphone, yeah.
Am I not on?
Now you hear you,
Can
but
hear
when
you.
you turn your head, we can't hear you very well.
Okay. I'm not convinced that Esau did marry the third one to please his parents. I think he was kind of stick it in their face because Ishmael was kind of the outcast, wasn't he?
Right,
I'm
yeah,
surprised he even appears in the story.
right. So, but at least Harvey Fields suggests that his motivation was, well, it is a first cousin, so it will please my parents more than just sticking with the two Hittites. But Yishmael is on the outs, and so is Asa. In traditional rabbinic thinking, Yishmael becomes the father of the Arabs and maybe the Muslims, and Asa becomes the father of the Christians. So these are the kind of archetypes for Arabs and Christians respectively. So neither family branch is considered to be very much part of the in group. Ray.
Well, it just occurred to me, if he had tried to divorce the first two Hittite wives, they probably would have just been thrown upon their own resources. And in those days, they didn't have many resources. They couldn't become nurses or teachers.
And certainly they couldn't become computer experts.
Right. At any rate, maybe that was why he didn't, because the custom was for them to have up to 4 wives. And if a brother died, you had to marry his wife so that the line could be continued. So their mores were a little bit different than ours. I wouldn't condemn him for not letting his 2 Hittite wives go. After all, Ruth was not a Jew. She was married to a Jew. When her husband died, she stuck with his mother, Ruth, and became with his mother, and Ruth became the mother of David. Yeah,
Right.
she
So
was the matriarch.
correct. So
Matriarch of that line.
Ray is
It's not
pointing out
foreign.
that within the Hebrew Bible, there's clearly at least 2 very different views on intermarriage or marrying outside of your tribe. One view is that you shouldn't do it under any circumstances. Another is that people from outside can enrich the inner group, provided that they accept the religious principles. And the book of Ruth is an example of this. Ruth is not just a Moabite. She's just a Moabite. Moabites were considered the worst, because they attacked the Israelite women and children in the desert. So the fact that Ruth could convert to Judaism and become the great grandmother of the king, King David, who's then going to become the ancestor of the Messiah, indicates that the writer of the book of Ruth wanted to show conversion from outside people into Judaism is not just good, but it's like the best. But the writers of Ezra and Nehemiah, on the other hand, were like, no, we don't want outsiders under any circumstances. So there's 2 very different views, but both views are going to be the outsiders can come in, either with great enthusiasm or reluctantly, provided that they convert to the religion of Israel. Now today we have, we'll get into this in the next few minutes, but our attitudes to what is acceptable in terms of intermarriage has changed. Other comments at this point? Steve or Dee or Bonnie? Benita or Minya? Shirley? Lorraine? Nan? Okay, everybody's happy.
Steve has his hand up.
Okay, Steve.
Well, I'm going to bring up my question probably a little bit later, but I wanted to get the differences between Reform, Orthodox, and Conservatives' thoughts on intermarriage as well. I
Okay.
think that will come up later.
Yes, and those views are changing, what it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago and what it is today, it may not be the same. But, remind us in about 20 minutes to raise that. Bonnie?
Reminds me of a line in West Side Story, to stick to your own kind. So that was even from way back when.
Right, and that was the Puerto Ricans and the Irish, was it?
The Puerto Ricans, I don't know if it was Irish, but it was
Puerto
definitely
Ricans
Puerto Rican and somebody.
and just-
Italians, Puerto Ricans and Italians, maybe?
Yeah, it was Italians. It was in that song, Maria.
Okay.
And how did women get so shortchanged?
Say again?
How did women get so shortchanged?
Oh, in general, well, the ancient Near East is certainly a very patriarchal place. So men really run things.
They certainly did.
And that's, that's clear. Okay, B, you can keep reading.
As the Torah portion indicates, the subject of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews has been a concern since the beginnings of Jewish history. We are not told what is that displeases Isaac and Rebekah about Esau's Hittite wives. Not that he had forbidden him to marry them, yet it's clear they are troubled by what Esau has done, and therefore warn Jacob not to marry from the Canaanites. They tell him to find a wife among the tribal family.
All right, so it looks like that Rebekah and Isaac don't have this policy to begin with. They don't tell Esau, don't marry them. It's just once they do, they realize this is a bad idea. So poor Esau, not that I want to defend him, but it doesn't look like he really was tipped off. It was just after he did it that his parents got mad at him. So, they apparently realized the Hittites were too much different. So, that's, okay, yeah, B, you can keep going.
Most modern biblical scholars are agreed that the two mentions of intermarriage in our Torah portion were written by authors who believed that religion and nationality could only be preserved through marriages within the tribal group. For instance, E.A. Spencer comments, whoever wrote these two passages were interested in purity and lineage. The Anchor Bible, Genesis, page 216. Separate for holy purpose. But there was another factor in Israel that tended to lift what might have been only a fierce, instinctive separation to the higher level of emotion. That was the passionate conviction that Israel is meant to be not only a nation, but a theocracy, rule of state by God and by God's priests, to maintain its racial integrity. Therefore, was to maintain the religious institution of the covenant and the law and the holy faith.
All right, so there's a suggestion, and this is from the Interpreter's Bible, which is a Christian commentary, but that Jews sometimes refer to quite a bit. So there is one, possibility here that it's not just about religion, it's about a tribal group, and that the only way to maintain the religion is to maintain the tribal group. They use the word racial integrity. And, I think today we avoid the term race and rate because it's constantly used in terms of racism. And racism has been redefined in recent years so that what racism means in some circles is very different than maybe what it meant, in the 1960s. So it becomes a very, very delicate and polemicized term. But I'll use the word tribal, but in America or in Western society, religion is religion, right? It's you adopt a religion by deciding you like the beliefs and the particular congregation, and that's it. But here it's suggesting that being Jewish, at least in the Bible, was not just a matter of religion, but also a matter of tribal connection, being part of the tribe. And that, all right, comments.
I have a question.
Okay, Babette and then Pam.
In Israel today, can a Jewish person be legally married to have a marriage ceremony to a non-Jew? I know that it's hard for them to prove they are Jewish when they're both Jewish, but is that, can they marry there?
Well, Israel has no civil marriage. So
Okay.
Christians can only marry Christians and Muslims can only marry Muslims and Orthodox Jews can only marry Orthodox Jews. And so if you're, for example, a Reformed Jew, you can't get married there at all. So what you can do is you take the boat, if you're on a
To
low budget,
Cyprus?
if you're on a low budget, you take the overnight boat to Cyprus for $35. And then you go into a justice of peace there and they'll marry you as long as you're not married to somebody else and, so forth. And then, Cyprus and Israel in almost every country has reciprocal agreements that they will accept each other's marriages. So then therefore you can marry a Christian or a Muslim or whoever you want. And then you come back with your marriage license from Cyprus and Israel will accept that marriage license. But that's the only way to do it at the moment. Pam and then Cy.
Well, I'm sorry, who's first?
Pam and then Cy.
I mean, presently we have a situation where in modern times, you don't marry your first cousin and close relatives to prevent birth effects, but we constantly see in these Torah, people are marrying close family members.
Right.
When did they get out of that practice? Because it sounds like a dangerous.
Well, they didn't. As I told you last week, I had an ex-girlfriend many years ago whose older sister in Cleveland, Ohio, had married her first cousin or eloped with her first cousin, who was a steel salesman. And the parents were against it, and the state of Ohio, it was prohibited. So they went over the border to Pennsylvania, according to the story. I presume it's correct. And then they were legally allowed to marry in Pennsylvania, first cousins. Then they came back to Cleveland, and I guess eventually the parents had to accept it. They had 2 normal children. And then I joked last week that those children married other first cousins and that, no. So, but they were lucky that they had no birth defects.
So when did the Jewish people get out of this custom of marrying close relatives? I mean, is this centuries or?
Yeah, I don't think it ever, got out of it, which is why people with high Ashkenazic Jewish genetics frequently have all these, problems, with certain genetic diseases and certain birth defect issues. I guess the practice of marrying each other's brothers and sisters' children, as a group gets a little bit bigger, that becomes unnecessary, but it was still, pretty inbred. And that's one of the nice things about now having more open marriage is you can bring in a more diverse gene pool, which is, sorely over, the time is, it's already late in the game for that. So that's a good thing.
But like the Navajos can't marry within the clan to prevent that type of thing where you were to get birth defects.
Yeah, so in Judaism, there wasn't really such a thing like that, and there still isn't. Sai.
At this point in time, were there a number of tribes that made up Judaism, separate tribes?
Well, we don't know. That's a good question. Like,
The reason I'm asking is because I had trying to remember my history. I think there were, and I'm very curious as to whether they all believed the same way, the same mythology, and everything that went with it.
it's a very good question. Certainly according to the Bible, there were the 12 tribes of Israel, which is based on the 12 sons of Jacob. According to a lot of the modern scholars, but not necessarily all of them, this was retroactive. In other words, the biblical author is describing, is writing backwards and is suggesting that something existed much earlier than it actually did. So, it's something we would really have to investigate. When did the 12 tribes come about? Did they have different beliefs? Was this a situation? I don't want to be too radical here. I don't want to make any enemies. But it is possible that there were these different tribes in Israel, in Canaan, and they were trying to build a unity among them. And so then they said all 12 tribes were the children of this ancestor Jacob, and all 12 tribes were in Egypt. And in other words, inventing a common history that didn't actually occur. So if I want to be friendly with Sai, I can say, we were in the army together. Remember Sai? And I could try to convince him that we were in the army together a long, long time ago. And, I'll start.
I was in the Navy.
In the Navy together. Whoop. And I can start to invent all sorts of stories about, Sai and I were on Navy, and then we would dock in these ports, and we would get drunk and have fun together. And, and Sai would, over the course of time, become friendlier with me because we have this common history, even if it's all kind of made up. So that is a possibility. Okay. Minya, any comment? No? Bernie? You're happy. Okay. B, you can keep going.
Okay, the Christian scholarly commentary Interpreter's Bible agrees with E.A. Spicer that the author of this part of our Torah portion was xenophobic. They feared strangers. They were concerned that strangers would marry their children and remove them from their community. As a result, they would not survive as a distinct people. For them, to marry outside the clan was to mix its blood and to break its solidarity. Fear of others and their foreign ways and beliefs was primary motivation for the opposition of Isaac and Rebekah to intermarriage. That is the reason they were grieved.
Okay, well, there you got it. So now we're today trying to about 12 years ago, our temple began bringing in families, and we opened a religious school, but we're still struggling. We're still very much struggling. The families, it's very difficult to integrate them. They don't want to come to services. We don't really see them much. And then when the bar mitzvah's over, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, resign or just stop paying their dues and disappear. And does this have to do, how much does this have to do with intermarriage? And it's partly, but not entirely, right? Because we all know intermarried couples where one partner did not convert and the other partner is, where they're both very active. So clearly religious intensity and intermarriage are not always a linear relationship. Right now, I know people that because they intermarried, they get more interested in Judaism, and the non-Jewish partner becomes also, I went on a bike trip once to Vietnam, and the husband wasn't Jewish and the wife was, and their two children had not turned out Jewish. But the husband, who was not Jewish, had never been Jewish, had never converted, he was more upset about this than his wife. So, it's not always the predictable exactly what the dynamic would be. Comments? Minya?
Isn't the statement about that we just heard that they feared, not so much they feared strangers, they were concerned that strangers would marry the children and remove them from community. Isn't that basically the Orthodox belief? And that's why their children don't go on the internet and don't find out about the outside world, because they don't want them to be exposed to anything that might take them away from Judaism.
Well, it's true for reform as well. Like if somebody would, I don't say in like I teach like the 7th and 8th grade, I don't say marry somebody Jewish because it's not a realistic expectation. But I would try to gently say, we hope that when you grow up, you'll be part of Judaism. That's a goal, and therefore whoever you might marry should be somebody who's willing to do that with you. So we also don't want strangers marrying our children and removing them from our community either. So it's any group, if you're going to perpetuate yourself, you want your children to continue in your tradition, right?
Well, of course you do, but you don't keep your children from learning about the outside world. I think that's a big difference.
But this doesn't say anything like, well, this says they feared strangers because they were concerned that strangers would remove them from their community. For whatever, for good or bad, we don't fear strangers, and our children interact with outsiders, but we hope that they'll bring them in. But that's not working out so well. So maybe the Orthodox are being more realistic about that when you're a minority in a culture, that you have a limited influence over children who are going to be exposed to that culture.
Well, at the time that this was written, they didn't have any concerns about TV, internet, social media, or all the other things that children today are exposed to.
Right, the metaverse is coming. the metaverse, so it'll be immersive. So you can instead of going on a safari and spending thousands of dollars and risking catching malaria, you can go on to the metaverse and you feel like you're there in the savannah and you're getting your foot all muddy and the rhino is running by you on the left and you could practically touch him, and it'll be an amazing experience. And so, but there can be a Jewish metaverse, but you have to be interested enough to go onto that and not just to stick to the whatever It's like the internet, right? You can use it for I could find out more about Judaism on the internet than I ever could as a child because I just had a few books my parents had. But most kids just use it for trivial things. Pam.
On the news yesterday, they said that meta means death in Hebrew.
Oh, mate, yeah, mate, female form of death, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just, so mate is a male dying and meta is a female dying. So it's just sort of a joke. Cy and then Marcia.
Well, I was going to ask if religion was the only commonality necessary for the marriage. And I'm asking whether education or economic well-being or other factors were just as important as the religion. I mean, he might have been very religious, but he might have been very poor or uneducated or something of that nature. How did that work itself out?
So say the question again.
How did the acceptance of the lack, for example, of education or the lack of economic background or some social background work itself out for the families to want their sons or their daughters to marry at a certain level?
Well, I guess, in Eastern Europe you're talking about.
Yeah.
So, in Eastern Europe, the Jews were almost, very heavily segregated. There was interactions, but it was not that extensive. So, and marriage there was a much stricter hierarchy, and the society was controlled by the rich and by the scholars, and those two groups working together. So the rich man would marry off his daughter to the scholar, and so it kind of would work out for those two groups. But if you weren't rich or a scholar, you were very resentful. So a lot of people came over to the US, were very angry and disappointed with the leaders in the Eastern European Jewish community. Riva.
Forgot me.
Oh, sorry, Marcia, then Riva.
Back to where we were looking at, not Eastern Europe, but in these times, Esau and Isaac, etc. Were these different tribes, different races? Because I know Moses had married a Black woman. Were the Hittites or the Moabites or whatever, were they different racially?
Well, we don't know, but presumably not. If they're all Canaanites, really, then all the Canaanites looked probably similar, maybe the same. Moses married a Cushite who was a different tribe further south. So that's why it's popularly assumed that she was Black. There's no proof of that, but that seems to be a generally accepted thing, that the Cushites were from the south and therefore were much darker. But the other tribes, as far as I could imagine, looked the same, but maybe they looked exactly the same, which is maybe one of the Israelite preoccupations with being different, is the fact that they weren't different from their neighbors at all. If they were a different color, for example, you wouldn't need all this focus on other things like what we eat to be different, because when you're different, when you're obviously different, it's, it's just you're different. But when you're not different, then, and you want to be different, is where you have to promote some sort of difference. Riva.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in my family, my father's sister married a Christian, and part of the family sat Shiva for the daughter who had escaped. and left and married somebody outside of Judaism. I wonder how far back that sort of thing goes.
I mean, hundreds of years, right? So I mean, you don't really care exactly when it starts, do you?
No, I'm just curious how much pressure was placed on people to stay within the community
Oh, well,
and how far
enormous
back
amount.
that goes.
Now, in some places such as Spain, there was tremendous pressure from the Catholic Church to convert to Christianity. And so, and then there were the riots in 1391. So after 1391, a good percentage of people that had been Jewish were now Christian. And so there were pressures on both sides, very intense pressures. And in Eastern Europe, tremendous pressures, so, to marry out, quote unquote, was considered to be a terrible thing. Yeah, you heard sigh. So, and there's been a huge, very rapid change in American society. I mean, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and my parents, who were typical Reform Jews, I would think, well, I don't recall necessarily my parents ever saying it, but I just got the impression from somebody that I was not supposed to marry somebody not Jewish. I can't ever recall my parents saying that, but they must have experienced that as well. But there was definitely that sense out there. And there's no sense of that at all. So it's changed very, very quickly, just over the course of my life. That attitude has just been abandoned. Shirley, is that a hand? You have to unmute.
Yep. I'm going to chime in here because I am the product of a mixed faith marriage. And my mother's family was Orthodox Jews, came over here in 1921, sorry. And my dad was from the back hills of Tennessee. And it was quite a combination. It was a marriage that never should have been and wouldn't last. But when my dad died in 2002, a month after the 67th wedding anniversary, they decided that maybe it was okay. But anyway, my grandfather named me in his Orthodox shul, and my dad converted, but he didn't convert to become Jewish. He converted because my mother's parents were sitting shiva for her, and they wouldn't talk to her. They loved my dad, introduced him proudly as their son-in-law, but wouldn't talk to my mother. And it took my birth to change everybody. But my dad came from Tennessee to seek his fortune because he decided he didn't want to be a farmer. And my mother, when they all landed in Detroit, so they met in Detroit, but they got married at the stroke of midnight, New Year's Eve, at 1934, and they both died in 2002. And I can't say they had the best marriage in the world, but they raised 3 children, and we all knew we were Jewish, but we didn't have a very strong Jewish education. But it was a very interesting thing because I had 2 sides of my family that were so opposite, and it was great growing up. I really enjoyed it.
And the only thing unusual, of course, about Shirley's story is the year 1934. If you changed it and said 1994, it would be not worthy of note. But 1934, that was still, quite uncommon. Interesting. And that serves as a segue to a more modern discussion of intermarriage. Anyone else want to pick up from Shirley and Bernie? You have to unmute.
I'm clicking the wrong thing. Interesting of note that 21 years ago, my daughter couldn't find a rabbi in the whole state of Colorado to marry her and my son-in-law, who's not Jewish, of course.
And that's only 21 years ago.
Right.
And why was that?
The rumor was that there was some quid pro quo between the Reform and the Orthodox rabbinate in the state.
Oh, yes, of course. I wrote about this in one of my books. There was in Denver anyway, there was an agreement on conversion between the Orthodox, conservative, and Reform rabbis. And there was an agreement that certain things would not be done. And in exchange, the Orthodox would accept the Reform conversion. So yes, exactly. Wow, yes, I wrote about that, yes. Stanley Wagner was involved in that. And I believe that Stephen Foster was involved in that. And there was a number of others.
Rabbi, which book for those of us who'd like to read it?
That's Contemporary American Judaism. Bernie, did you want to add anything to that? No? Okay, Marcia.
I think we all have stories like that. My sister came home with her fiance who was Irish, and I remember the argument in my family happening, and I was 13 years younger. So when I got to the point that I was dating, I went out once with a German person from my school, and I knew if I continued the relationship with him, there would be war in the household. And then I met my husband in class, and he had red hair and a Germanic last name, Gratz, and which is Austrian. And until he mentioned that his brother's son was having a bris, I was really worried about it, because I didn't want to go through that grief with my family. I said, this just isn't worth it, So I think we all, growing up, somehow or other got the hint, to realize what was expected of us, so to speak.
All right, so it wasn't, what my family was not unusual in that my parents did not explicitly talk about it, but somehow it was communicated.
Right.
It was more of a societal value. I'm not sure how strongly my parents felt about that. It was more the general family and community.
Right.
So you can see that being strongly part of the community, you absorb the community's values, and those can be different than your parents' values. Minya, you must have a strongly held opinion on this subject.
No, I was just thinking of my mother, I think, changed her attitude when she had a friend who, same thing, the daughter came home with somebody who wasn't Jewish on his motorcycle. And the parents said, if you stay with him, we're going to sit Shiva for you. And this is going back into the 50s, I guess. No, early 60s. And the woman, the young girl, and her boyfriend were killed in a car accident. And after that, my mother was like, it's not worth losing your children over something like saying, we're not going to sit Shiva for them, or we are going to sit Shiva for them. And she said to me, it's more important that you be happy in your life. I would never do that to you. So I always think of that story when it comes to making decisions about intermarriage. Our children are both married to people who aren't Jewish. They're very happy. I don't think up to this point, they've made a decision one way or the other. They're going to allow their children to make the decisions by presenting both sides. My daughter's married to a non-practicing Catholic, but his mother is very Catholic. So she takes every opportunity she can to tell the children about Jesus. And my daughter tells them that they're Jewish. So it's a very interesting situation in that case. And my son also is married to someone who's a non-practicing Catholic. And they're very happy. So you really have to ask yourself what's important to you in your life. and the fact that my children are happy and are raising beautiful children. And they're wonderful parts of society that I have to let the religious part go because it really isn't my decision to make anyway. But yes, when I grew up, I had the same thing you did, which was my parents never said to me, don't you dare go out with someone who's not Jewish, but I knew it. So I listened. I married to someone Jewish. So that's my little story.
Now we have to differentiate between the reasons. We're not going to be able to read it all, but if you read the chapter, you saw that a lot of the discussion in the Bible is about avoiding idolatry, right? So the Hittite women or the other women, and then later with Solomon marrying all these foreign princesses, they bring their idols into the home with them. So this is issue number one, is prevention of idolatry. Number two, a different issue, which we've already touched upon, is group cohesion. And a third issue would be Jewish religious activity. So you have to decide if you're not in favor of intermarriage, what is the reason? Is it a sociological reason you want to keep the Jewish community together? Is it an opposition to idolatry? Is it an interest in Jewish religious activities? In other words, what is the reason for your opposition, if there is one? But there's at least three very different reasons that are totally different, actually. Other comments, responses to on a more personal level about intermarriage. Steve.
We adopted our daughter about 40 years ago, and not knowing whether she came from a Jewish family or not, our rabbi highly suggested that we take her through the mikveh, which happened to be in Tulsa, Oklahoma, compared to Oklahoma City because they didn't have one. So my wife at the time and daughter, who was about 2.5 months old, drove up to Tulsa, went through the mikveh, and then came back. So in order for her, in case she was wanting to marry an Orthodox Jew, she would be able to through this conversion.
Wow. Nan.
My interfaith relationships go back a little further. My mother's brother in the 40s married an Italian woman who did convert, but the girls, their two daughters, my cousins, didn't really go through Jewish education as children. One of my cousins had an adult bat mitzvah. The other one married, her first marriage was to a non-Jew, but her second was to a practicing Jew, and they adopted two children, one of whom was from an Irish family and one who was part Native American, and they both had bat mitzvahs and in Bloomington, Indiana, and were raised as Reform Jews, and their Jewish identity is very, very strong. My parents never said, I only want you to marry Jews. And it's interesting because my sisters and I, all of us have married Jews in all of our marriages. And, but dating, we dated all kinds of men and boys. And, if I dated in high school, I dated a couple of non-Jewish boys, and some were Catholic, some were Christian. My mother never said to me, you are forbidden to see this person. My mother said, she knew I was young and I was not going to run out the door and get married the next day. So that, yeah, I could have been a first love, but it was not going to be the person I would end up with. So, and I've done that with my girls. My oldest daughter is married to a Muslim, and my younger daughter, she only dated non-Jewish boys, and my grandson's father is non-Jewish, but he knows me as the Jewish grandma. And so Judaism is very important to him. It's a part of his life. I mean, he's only 24, so when he makes his life decision for a partner, who knows? But, he celebrates both. And, it's worked well in my family.
Dee or Bonnie or Benita? Benita. You have to unmute.
Yeah, I did. The only thing I can say is that I was probably wrong, but I still believe it with my heart. I mean, my mother would have died if I married someone who wasn't Jewish. So, and I was brought up in a neighborhood where it was like 90% Jewish. The school, the teachers, I lived in, I never really had to go outside of my community to meet people. But when my children got older, all I said to them is, I won't disown you by any means if you get married, but Daddy and I will not, we will not watch you walk down an aisle in a church. We will not. And that was the only stipulation I had. And one married a Jewish person who doesn't even exist Jewish. And the other two, but they never were. I mean, I would not have gone to the wedding. We would have went to the reception, but we would not give you a blessing. And I would stick to that today. I could not watch my child or grandchild go down an aisle in a church. I just can't. So, I mean, I might be wrong, but.
So of the three options I gave you, opposition, idolatry, group cohesion, or Jewish theology, your opposition to a church wedding is more which of those three? In other words, what's the objection? In other words, if they marry somebody who's not any religion and they say, I'm not going to if they're like both communists and they're both against religion, that's better than marrying in a church. Why?
That's a good question.
Because it's just my belief that I just couldn't do it. I mean, I just couldn't watch it. I mean, I've been in a church, I've been in Catholic churches, like on Christmas Eve with my friends. I mean, fine, go to church. I'm not participating, but I don't believe in anything they believe in.
So is it a rejection? Is it that it's a rejection of Jewish theology that upsets you, or is that you see Catholicism as a form of idolatry? So is it
yeah, I would say that. Yeah.
Okay, so that's it. I was hoping you would admit to that. Yeah. So
yeah.
So it would be marginally acceptable, not good, but acceptable if a child becomes an atheistic communist and marries another atheistic communist, but Catholicism or certain types of Christianity are seen as somehow being, somehow more hostile or historically to Judaism. Okay, thank you very much, Benita. Any other responses specifically to that, maybe? Pam, and then Minya, and then Ray.
But there's a trend, and it occurs in our family, where people have a civil ceremony, Jewish and a non-Jewish person have a civil ceremony, and then they make a decision together on what religion they're going to raise the children. And in our case, the grandchildren are being raised of civil ceremony, but the grandchildren are being raised Jewish. And they're all both in Hebrew school.
And I had congregants in Georgia who were married in a church, and then now he's president of the temple there, and the kids were all raised Jewish. later they made that decision, yes. Okay, who was next is Minya, Ray, and then Reva, and then Lorraine.
I had a similar experience to Steve when our daughter was born. We got her when she was about 2 weeks old. And we didn't have to go to a mikveh. The rabbi where we belonged at the time was conservative, and we lived near a lake. So he told us to take her in the lake, and then he did whatever kind of blessing he did. But he said the same thing that you mentioned, and I wanted to bring that up, and that was you needed to go through the ceremony in case she ever wanted to marry an Orthodox Jew. And I'm asking, isn't that interesting that Orthodox Judaism was the benchmark here, that this was done to be Orthodox? So that's my comment.
Okay, who is next? Ray?
No.
Okay, Ray, unmute.
Ray, you're still muted.
Okay,
I married.
No.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I married a Minneapolis man and went to live in Minneapolis. I fell in love with the twins of an uncle who was a doctor, and I saw her go through the time that she had a Lutheran boyfriend. Minnesota is full of Lutherans, as you may well guess.
So it's Sun City.
Neither side wanted to accept this marriage, and they really, really pressed on the children. My uncle and his wife decided that they weren't going to keep their daughter from her happiness, and they finally started to agree. But the Lutherans, bango, no. Many years later, she married. The marriage lasted 5 years. All the years that she's been one of my dearest friends, she never married. Not until she was in her 60s did she, her 70s, did she finally begin to live with another gentleman who's Jewish, and they live as man and wife and are doing well. But that example said to me, don't you tell your children whom to marry. It's going to be on your shoulders if they're not happy. And so my husband and I, we never talked about it. I know that the first boy who fell in love with a Catholic girl, I never said anything, but I couldn't make up to her. I couldn't feel whole with her. They married, and they are the best for each other. They couldn't have gotten a more perfect mate for each other. That girl is now like a daughter to me. They do not belong to any church at all. I ended up with 4 non-Jewish daughter-in-laws. None of them go to their churches or their synagogues. My oldest son does. They all sit Shiva for their father. They all enjoy the Jewish Passover, and but they do not go to services over the high holidays. This is a regret to me, but I'm glad that I never said no, because these girls are wonderful to me.
Now I'll point out here, when Shirley's mother married her father in 1934, this is a very different atmosphere than when, somebody in the last few decades.
My
the-
oldest son did marry a Jewish girl. It finally ended in divorce after 30 years. And he went back to his college sweetheart and married her. And it is so good for both of them. I deeply regret that I don't know what will happen. One grandchild has married a Jew. My two local grandchildren are proud to say that they are Jewish, but they are not practicing Jews. But the one boy's name for himself on the internet is Jew Boy. They prefer being identified as Jews. And I think that was because of my husband and I having a very deep influence on them.
Okay, who's next? Riva, and then Lorraine, and then D, and then B.
Yeah, in my family, my nieces and nephews mostly married people who were not Jewish. But a number of the next generation, my cousin's children, some of those children converted back to Judaism, although because their fathers were Jewish, their mothers were something else. So it was interesting that some of those kids felt somehow in some way that they were Jewish or they wanted to be Jewish. They went through the Jewish conversion process to become Jewish. My niece, Sarah Rosenberg, was brought up Lutheran, decided she really wanted to be Jewish. I think since the whole world thought she was Jewish anyway with that name, and went through an extensive conversion process. Just one other final comment. My late husband and I seemed to be very similar. And when we met each other, there were just so many commonalities we had. And it felt for us like it was beshert, as quite a few couples experience it. We did 23andMe together. It turns out we're sixth cousins. We would have never figured that out ourselves. But I think we just instinctively realized that there were a lot of things that we shared.
Who's next? Was that Lorraine, and then
Yeah.
D, and then B, and then
Okay,
Sai?
sure. I'm next. Okay, I'm gonna do a little bit of snippets. I'm calling it from Lorraine's life. I remember the senior boat ride at high school, and this adorable, tall, which was real important to me in those days, very tall Christian fella asked me to go. And I told my mom, we were very close. I had never dated a non-Jew before. And I told her, that he was coming to pick me up and blah, blah, blah. And she said, "Are you going?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "You'll see. They're different." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "They drink." Well, I don't remember what happened. I don't remember going. I don't know if something happened. Somebody got sick in his family, I think, and we couldn't go. So I can't tell you how that ended. Now, the second thing is I have two sons. They were brought up Jewish. Bert and I are Jewish. His family's Jewish. My family's Jewish. And when he started dating this young lady, who he has eventually married, and they're married 25 years already, and it's a very strong, good marriage, and she's Catholic. And he said to me, "I'm going to marry Tracy." And I said, "Oh." And he said, "Ma, I'm just in high school now. Why are you worried about it? Who knows what I'm going to do when I'm older? So don't get all bent out of shape." He said, dating and marriage are very different. Well, P.S., they did get married. They got married by what's called an interfaith minister, I think. She was Jewish by birth. It was a Jewish service. It was with total blessings from my daughter-in-law to be's family. When Tracy and Evan told her parents that they were going to marry, and they were crazy about him, they said, better a child. And they asked, well, what about when you have children? And they said they're going to be Jewish, of course. We weren't involved in this decision at all. Evan felt stronger about the Jewish religion than she did about her Catholic background, and therefore they raised the children Jewish. If you woke my grandchildren up till this day in the middle of the night, God forbid, during a fire with all the confusion, and you said, Evan, Mark, what religion are you? They would both, without a second's hesitation, say Jewish. And yet, grandson number one, child of their first marriage, the first one's marriage, is marrying a non-Jewish girl from another culture, another country, another everything. And he told me, Grandma, the wedding is not going to have a lot of Jewish stuff, as he puts it, in it, but we're going to break the glass. We're going to have a chuppah. When they have children, if they have children, that's totally their decision. Bert and I have never tried to influence anyone to what they should do. Also, people would say to me, you're going to make your daughter-in-law convert, right? Heck no. Conversion should be something that a person wants from their heart, not because it's a term, thank you, Pam, of a marriage. That is ridiculous. And so the kids went to Hebrew school, and they are Jewish because that's what they want, not because mommy had to convert. However, I will say she took them to all their lessons, all their Jewish programs. They both, grandchildren, taught in the Hebrew school. The second they were finished with that, they never went to temple again. And she never went. She never really felt that comfortable. Okay, one more thing. A friend out here in Arizona always asks me when we meet a new person and I introduce her and then I walk away, she always says, are they a MOT? And I said, what is that? I don't know. Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
Member of the tribe.
Thank you. That's exactly what it is. And Babette, you know who that is. It was Diane. She always asks. It's the last thing I look at when I meet a person. I want them to be a good person. And that's right now, I have another grandchild who is dating a girl, totally a different race, a different culture. She's Indian, she's Hindu, she's dark-skinned, she's delightful, she's bright. That's what I like. And she's so good to us. I don't know what the answer is. I don't think there is an answer. I think this is a wonderful discussion to hear how different families are handling these issues, but I would never force anyone in my children's lives to convert. And I would never say, I will not walk down the aisle with you. I would never say, I'm going to sit shiva for you. It just goes against my belief of acceptance and tolerance. That's
Okay,
it.
Thank you, Lorraine. Who's next? Is it B?
Welcome.
Okay, B. You have to unmute.
Well, I come from an immigrant family, so it was even worse than my family about intermarriage. My parents did
It's breaking up.
someone I tried that, was probably the most handsome man I'd ever seen. He came home, what? Are you hearing me?
B, you have two audios
Hello?
going.
Yeah, and you're breaking
So
down.
when I
Audio.
came home from the,
I'll remove the other
what's going
audio.
on?
Let's see if that helps. So.
Did you hear me at all?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, I'll repeat. My parents were what you'd call today conservadox, but more orthodox, and they came from Europe, and my father was educated at a yeshiva in Europe. Well, when it came to dating, I knew that I should date someone Jewish, but occasionally I didn't. So my parents even were opposed to the Sephardic guy I dated. They had a fit because he was Sephardic, but he was Jewish. And then there was the one Christian that came to the house who probably should have been on the cover of a magazine. And when I came home, I asked what they thought of him. They said, ordinary goy. I got the message, okay? But then I married a Jew and was unhappy for 34 years. So that, doesn't mean anything. My daughter got married at 39, and she married a very serious Catholic. She made the decision that she would allow them to bring up their children Catholic. I have one grandson from them, and he goes to church every Sunday with his father. My daughter never converted because she doesn't believe in it. But I do have two grandchildren. My oldest daughter married a Jewish man. They got divorced later, but in the interim, I have two children that are both Jewish, bar and bat mitzvah. So there's nothing I can do about any of them. And I just have to accept, because I love my children and my grandchildren. I would never think to ostracize or ask anyone to convert. It's not me to make their decisions. It's not at all. And you're right, it's from the heart. If anyone converts, they have to feel it. If they don't feel it, it's not an appropriate conversion. So anyway, that's my story with my very strict parents. But it all worked out, I guess, for the best.
Thank you, B. Sai, you have to unmute. And that Sai, and then Babette, and then D. I'm sorry, D was first. I'm sorry. D, Sai, and Babette.
And listening to all the stories, I'm beginning to wonder if all these pressures is one of the main reasons why so many Jewish people, young people at least, have dropped out of the religion. That's a lot of pressure they keep getting. And the kids don't want to have that kind of pressure. So rather than have it, I'll not be Jewish. I'll not be anything. And that eliminates any kind of pressure.
D.
I have two separate stories. My first is my second marriage was Jewish, my husband, and we had 20 years of raising my three children as Jews. And then when we got divorced, he married a very anti-Semitic, non-Jewish woman who was very against my children being Jewish. And because we split co-parenting, there was a tremendous impact on the children. They were young. So I had to give in, because tradition matters to me more than anything, at least some sort of a rooting that I have from my enriched, very conservative background that I wanted my children to have. But unfortunately, because of the pull from my ex-husband and his wife, I have three grown children, and I've discussed it with the rabbi. My older daughter, who is in the Navy, she is non-practicing, and she was indoctrinated to very heavy Judaism, and the whole Torah. She's turned away, bless you. And then my my other son, as Rabbi knows, he's living in Germany as a communist and has no affinity to Judaism whatsoever. My youngest son, who is the medical student who's with me, up until he went to Israel, he said, I'm an atheist. I'm like, okay, if you want to be an atheist, just be happy. He comes back from Israel and his entire world, I thought that would happen, but he's now very Jewish. And in fact, I just spoke to him. He's overseas in medical school. He went to Shabbat service, and Rabbi knows he's on the island of Grenada at St. George University. And the rabbi and his wife invited him for dinner. And he talked to me a couple of days ago. He said, Mom, it was incredible. And he met a lot of Jewish students. And it really it just made my heart feel so good that I have this one son, because I feel it's not important, to whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish, but to have some sort of a connection to roots and traditions is important in life today, because we have such a crazy world we live in. So my story is, now I'm married, after being married to Jews, to a man who came from an evangelical background. And we were like North and South Pole for several years. And I had great difficulty not embracing David as my husband, but many of his beliefs, because they're antithetical to everything I am. So I opened the door I said, why don't you come into my world and do the Torah and study with me and see how you feel about everything. So because of his wanting to belong with me, because he knows I have these enriched Jewish roots, he has been studying, and it's completely changed his entire perception of what he was taught, programming. So programming, I think we're all programmed, and I think that can have a great impact. Just like thousands of years ago, our people programmed their children. And I think that that's part of the problem in life, is programming. So I respect Lorraine saying, because I'm the same way, whatever makes you happy. I don't care who you are, as long as you're a good person and you have a good heart. So I have my situations, obviously, with my kids, but they're happy and they're living their lives. And hopefully maybe my young son turning back to Judaism. I don't know whether he'll ever get married. He says he doesn't want children or marriage, but maybe he will marry a Jewish person, whatever. Anyway, it's been an interesting journey for me, coming from where I come from and being married to a man that was an extreme evangelical. And now everything is kind of coming together after 17 years. So I've had both sides of it, and life goes on.
Well, Dee, I see a book in your story.
I've been approached many times, Pam, by that. I've had a very unique kind of a life, yes. And maybe I will write my memoirs. I don't know if I need, I don't know. If I find I should talk to the rabbi. He's published a lot of books. He can help me with an editor. Anyway.
Thank you, Dee. We have, is that a hand? Steve, Bernie, Babette was first. Babette, Steve, Bernie, and then I think we're out of time, but we'll try to fit in Riva. Steve.
Oh, I was just gonna say, let's get some final comments going and then conclude.
Okay, so Babette, Bernie, and Riva.
My story's different. My parents were not practicing Jews. We didn't go to temple together when I was younger, but I had some Jewish girlfriends, and I embraced Judaism. I convinced my parents to go to temple, and I had, a confirmation. And although I dated some people who were not Jewish, one fellow in particular, a Greek fellow, my parents loved him, but I was on my way to Israel, so I was not going in that direction. But my husband and I knew each other from college. We got together after I returned from Israel, and it of course developed, but he refused to get bar mitzvah because he was mad at his parents when he was younger. They were strange people. And when it came time for us to get married, he said, I'm not getting married in temple. So I said, well, if you're not getting married in temple, we're not getting married. I won't do it. I will not have a civil ceremony. For me, it's a religious ceremony. It's a promise before God, and it's that, or you'll have to move on.
Wow.
So I have the opposite from all of you.
Wow. Well, but you've always been a little countercultural.
Yeah, you think?
We had 2 more comments for today. Sorry, we're running over a little bit. Bernie and then Riva.
No, I don't have anything more to say. I have to go to another meeting though. I'll see y'all next week.
Okay, Riva, bye, Bernie.
Bye.
Bye, Riva, last comment
Yeah.
and then back to Steve.
And I'll try and be quick. I had a very diluted Jewish education, and I didn't stick with it. It felt like it wasn't giving me anything at all. It really didn't help me grow as a person. And it made it very difficult for me to pass that along to my son. Now that I have grandchildren and I've had the opportunity to begin to do Jewish learning and study, I've grown a much greater appreciation for what Judaism offers in terms of our lives and in terms of our ethics. And what I do is I share that with my grandchildren. I'm not trying to convert them, but I want them to understand some of the richness of what Judaism has to offer. And one of my grandchildren considers himself Jewish, although he has a Catholic mother. And so I think you live your life, you do the very best you can. Some of us have been fortunate enough to start getting some Jewish education a little late, but you do with it what you can. And I'm very, very grateful for the adult education programs that are offered now through our temple. I think they're wonderful.
Okay, back to you, Steve.
Very good. Let us conclude. Get on with the rest of our day. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam
Asher natan banu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Torah.
Blessed is Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who has given us the teaching of truth and planted within us eternal life. This is Adonai, giver of the Torah. Amen.
Amen.
Have a good rest of the week, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
You too.